The morning broke with a pale light that spilled gently across the modest village of Ashbourne, a place where every routine was known and every neighbour recognized. Yet, for Miss Clara Whitmore, that particular dawn promised to alter the gentle order of her days. She had risen early, as was her habit, her mind still marvelling at the title she bore so newly, that of veterinarian, a profession bold enough to raise both admiration and murmurs in certain circles. As she was preparing to step into her small garden, she was interrupted by the hurried clatter of hooves in the lane. A stable boy dismounted before her gate, his cheeks flushed from haste, his hand clutching an envelope sealed with a wax crest. He delivered it without ceremony, only with a muttered, "From Willowbrook, miss." Then, as though his task had been of great weight, he retreated swiftly, leaving Clara with the letter in hand and a heart oddly unsettled. She turned the envelope over, her eyes catching the bold, almost stern handwriting that inscribed her name. The seal bore the insignia of the Harrow estate, Willowbrook, a place both admired and avoided in equal measure. The name of its master, Mr. Nathaniel Harrow, was spoken in the village with something akin to reverence mixed with unease. He was a man who carried the solemn dignity of wealth and position, yet also the mark of solitude. Since the passing of his beloved wife, it was said he had withdrawn into himself, becoming more a shadow among his lands than a presence in society. With careful fingers, Clara broke the seal. The words within were plain, direct, devoid of the flourishes one might expect in correspondence of such kind. Miss Whitmore, a mare of great value is suffering at Willowbrook. Your presence is required without delay. N. Harrow. That was all. No courtesy beyond necessity, no polite preamble. Yet the very severity of it carried a certain gravity, a silent command. Clara felt her pulse quicken. This, then, would be her first true commission, her first chance to prove that her long years of study had not been in vain. But it was more than professional excitement that stirred her. A name so cloaked in mystery, an estate spoken of in hushed tones, all seemed to call her into a story she had not expected to live. She gathered her instruments with care, the modest satchel that had been her constant companion through study and apprenticeship, filled with tinctures, bandages, and instruments of her new calling. At the threshold, she paused, the crisp spring air brushing her face, fragrant with earth and the faint promise of blossoms. The road to Willowbrook stretched beyond the familiar lanes, winding through meadows where skylarks trilled and the river whispered beneath willows. As Clara guided her modest carriage along the path, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Was it not peculiar, she mused, that her very first case should take her into the domain of a man whose grief had become local legend? The estate emerged at last, vast and commanding, its stone walls softened by ivy, its pastures alive with the silhouettes of grazing horses. A hush seemed to linger over the place, not of neglect, but of dignity tinged with sorrow. Clara drew a steadying breath. She was here as a servant of her calling, yet her heart told her that this was but the beginning of something greater than the mending of a single ailing mare. For even before she crossed the threshold of Willowbrook, she sensed that destiny had quietly placed her at the gate of another solitude, and perhaps, unknowingly, at the threshold of her own transformation. The next morning, Clara stepped into the stable with careful strides, the morning breeze carrying the scent of damp straw and aged leather. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden boards, illuminating specks of dust that danced in the air like tiny golden sparks. There, in the far corner, stood Ashen, the most imposing of Mr. Harlan's horses, a stallion with a coat grey as polished stone and eyes gleaming with an intelligence almost human. At the sight of her, the animal lifted his head proudly, snorting loudly, as though announcing he would not be tamed by just any stranger. Clara, however, did not retreat. She approached slowly, her boots crunching over the dry straw, and raised one hand in a calm gesture. "Well, well, Master Ashen," she murmured softly, as if addressing an old friend. "You need not fear. I am here only to care for you." The stallion neighed, a low, distrustful sound, and struck the earth with his hoof. For an instant, Clara felt the weight of that silent challenge, yet she held her ground. She extended her hand until it nearly brushed his muzzle, speaking in a quiet voice as though to a frightened child. "You are strong and beautiful, but even the strongest need care." With surprising slowness, Ashen lowered his muzzle toward her, inhaling her scent. When contact was made, the faint brush of warm hair against Clara's skin seemed to seal a silent pact. The stallion, once restless, drew a deep breath, and as if surrendered to her unexpected tenderness, let his head rest against her hand. From outside, in the shadow of the doorway, Mr. Harland watched in silence. His face remained austere, his body rigid, as though bound by a lifelong habit of hardness etched into his very bones. Yet his eyes, fixed on the young woman's gesture, betrayed a storm of thoughts. How dare she, he wondered silently, how dare she speak to such a creature as though it were no more than a frightened child, and yet be obeyed? Harland, long accustomed to seeing rough men driven back by Ashen, had never imagined that a feminine voice, gentle yet unwavering, could break through the animal's distrust. Clara, unaware of the stern gaze upon her, stroked the horse's neck with reverence. Her eyes shone not merely with the triumph of winning the stallion's trust, but with the renewed certainty that she had chosen the profession she was born to follow. And while Ashen rested quietly, as though he had forgotten all his proud defiance, the heart of the widower Harland throbbed in silence, seized by a feeling he would not utter aloud. The following days brought Clara a curiously pleasant routine. Each morning the stable welcomed her with the scent of fresh hay and the imposing presence of Ashen, who now approached with an almost haughty docility, as if to show the world that he had chosen to trust only her. And, invariably, there was Mr. Harland. Never on purpose, of course, for a man of his rigidity would never admit that he appeared simply to watch her, but there was always a practical reason for his presence: to check the reins, inspect the horseshoes, assess the grain supply. The conversations that took place were brief, often interrupted by the creak of a door or the impatient whinny of another horse. Still, Clara began to notice that beneath his terse words lay a refined sense of humor, so subtle that it revealed itself only to those patient enough to perceive it. "He no longer treats her like the stranger she once was, does he?" Harland remarked, referring to Ashen, while pretending to busy himself with the sattel hanging on the wall. "Perhaps because even horses prefer gentleness to force, sir," Clara replied without listing her eyes, though a smile escaped despite her efforts. Mr. Harland raised an eyebrow slightly. The response was neither insolent nor reverent. It was rather proof that this young woman was not easily intimidated. For a moment, silence settled again, and Clara, attentive, realized that this silence was not empty, but filled with unspoken words, a quiet charged with both distrust and a growing curiosity. "I see you speak as one who has read more books than is proper for a young lady," he commented, in a tone that wavered between critique and teasing. Clara raised her eyes to meet his, cold at first glance, but perhaps, just perhaps, warmed by a flicker of interest. "And I see you listen as one who does not like to be surprised." There was a pause. The only sound filling the space between them was Ashen chewing the straw. Instead of replying, Mr. Harland let out a brief, almost imperceptible laugh, a sound so rare that Clara questioned whether she had truly heard it or if it had only been her imagination. In that instant, she knew. There were cracks in the wall he had built around himself, small, discreet, but real. And though no further words were spoken, Clara left the stable with the sense that, little by little, each visit was becoming less an obligation and more a puzzle she longed to unravel. On the afternoon when the foal was born sickly, the sky seemed to share in the unease that settled over the farm. Grey clouds dragged lazily across the horizon, and a heavy breeze heralded a coming storm. Summoned in haste, Clara found the small creature lying upon the straw, its body trembling, its eyes half closed. There was no room for hesitation. With sleeves rolled up, she knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the dust mixed with damp hay. Her hands, delicate in appearance yet firm in action, began to massage the foal's frail flank, striving to rouse him. The effort was not merely physical, but steeped in tenderness. Every gesture seemed to declare that life, however fragile, was worthy of tireless defense. It was in this scene that Mr. Harland appeared. At the stable door, his figure cast a shadow that, at first, seemed only that of a man idly curious, yet his eyes, keener than usual, betrayed something more. Clara did not notice him at once. She was far too occupied with her patient, murmuring soft words to the animal, as though gentleness might turn to medicine. Harland, meanwhile, observed in silence, like one surprised to find virtue where he had least expected it. "He will not endure without added strength," he said at last, his deep voice echoing through the space. Clara lifted her face, damp with sweat, a wisp of straw tangled in her hair. For a fleeting instant, she thought she glimpsed something new in the widower's hardened features. Not merely the usual severity, but a spark of genuine concern. "Then help me, sir. Hold him here, at the neck, firmly, but without harshness." There was a pause, brief yet weighty. It was not common for anyone to issue Mr. Harland direct instructions. Even so, he stepped forward, kneeling in the straw beside her. His calloused hands, accustomed to toil and discipline, met the gentleness of her youthful ones. They did not touch, yet the nearness alone was enough to awaken a strange awareness between them. For long hours they labored together, he supporting the foal, she administering small measures of care, both covered in the same dust, bound by the same effort. The silence they shared was not hostile, but companionable. It required no words, for every shared gesture spoke louder than lengthy discourse. At one point, Clara dared a glance at him. His face, weathered by sun and time, was softened now by something rare, admiration. Caught under her gaze, he turned away quickly, as though fearful of being discovered in the very act of feeling. "It is only duty," he murmured, as if he must justify to himself the unexpected willingness to aid. Clara, however, kept silent, perhaps because she knew that some truths revealed themselves more in what is denied than in what is confessed. When at last the foal showed signs of improvement, a deeper sigh, a small effort to lift its head, Clara felt a relief so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Harland, however, merely rose, brushing the dust from his clothes with brusque motions. "What was needful has been done," he said, striding away in long steps, as though distance were the only means of containing what his presence had betrayed. Clara remained by the animal's side, yet within herself she knew something had changed, not only in the foal, now fighting for life, but in Mr. Harland, whose fortress, for the first time, had yielded, not to words, but to the weight of silence shared in the dust of the stable. The storm broke with fury that afternoon, turning the green fields into a blur of rain and wind. Clara, already accustomed to the routine of the stables, felt compelled to remain in the main house, for to return by the muddy road would have been too great a risk. Mrs. Elwood, the housekeeper, stern yet kindly, knocked upon her chamber door with an air of authority and insistence. "Miss Clara, pay no heed to the rain. Sup with us, I beg you. The table is laid, and it would not be proper to leave you alone in such a tempest." Clara hesitated for only a moment, her thoughts lingering on the scent of straw and the foal still under her care, but at last she consented, bowing her head with quiet grace. The dining table was set with rigor, as was the custom in Mr. Harland's household. A spotless cloth, porcelain dishes aligned with precision, and silverware gleaming in the candlelight. The widower entered shortly thereafter, carrying with him a presence that filled the room, not through expansiveness, as so many men of the district employed at formal dinners, but through control. Each step was measured, every gesture exact, reflecting years of discipline and solitude. Clara took her place, keenly aware of the weight of silent expectation. For the first few minutes, their exchange hovered between polite courtesies and long silences, bordering on uneasy. Harland's gaze met hers on occasion, always fleeting, as though wary of the intimacy that might bloom unbidden. "The storm does seem fiercer this year, does it not?" Clara ventured, leaning slightly over her plate. He inclined his head in brief assent, though his eyes betrayed a trace of distraction, as though her words had roused something deeper than the weather. As the meal progressed, the conversation discovered small alcoves of common ground, books and music. Clara spoke softly of a novel she had recently read, describing the author's gift for capturing silent emotions, while Harland, in his grave, controlled voice, remarked upon a collection of sheet music he had kept, revealing an old passion hitherto concealed. "Music has always seemed to me capable of speaking what words cannot," he said at last, almost in a whisper, as though fearing the silence of the room might swallow such a confession whole. Clara answered with a restrained smile, struck by the contrast between the rigidity of his manner and the sensitivity that flickered in his words. Between glasses of wine and carefully served dishes, a fragile intimacy emerged, not wrought by grand declarations, but by subtle gestures, discreet glances, and a shared reverence for what each held dear. Mrs. Elwood, ever observant, watched with quiet satisfaction, discerning that the young lady's gentle temperament was beginning to find its way past the widower's defences. By the close of the supper, with the storm still lashing the panes, Clara retired to her chamber, reflecting upon the surprise his culture and refinement had stirred within her. He was not merely a taciturn, withdrawn farmer, but a man who guarded memories and passions as one might safeguard rare treasures, and perhaps, as she sensed, he was beginning to feel the temptation of sharing those treasures, cautiously, with someone who could appreciate the worth of silence and attentiveness.
That day, Clara arrived early at the stable, carrying her usual case of materials and a quiet determination. As she walked down the corridor leading to the main wing of the house, something caught her attention. Upon the mahogany table, half covered by papers and old notes, rested a piano score. The paper, yellowed with age, bore the marks of delicate fingers with small notes written by hand in an elegant and precise script. Clara's heart quickened slightly, not out of idle curiosity, but from a sense of reverence. It was evident that the sheet belonged to Mr. Harland's late wife, and the silence that lingered around it seemed heavy with memories she herself did not dare disturb. When he entered the room, his steps were soft, almost hesitant. Upon noticing the score in her hands, his eyes, usually stern and assessing, softened for a fleeting instant. "I see you have found it," he began, his voice slightly unsteady, as though the mere mention awakened echoes of the past. Clara returned a serene smile, offering no words that might intrude upon his grief. "It is beautiful. I imagine it must have meant much to her." He nodded slowly, turning his gaze to the window, watching the glow of the sunset filtering through the stained glass. That moment, laden with memory and silence, was not heavy nor oppressive. It was, in a way, a bridge. Clara remained there, motionless, her hands folded before her, showing through the simple gesture the same patience she devoted to the wounded animals in the stable. In the minutes that followed, they spoke little. Words would have been unnecessary, perhaps even improper. The young veterinarian understood that Mr. Harland's sorrow and longing did not require speeches, but presence, a silent respect, firm yet delicate. With each visit thereafter, that very patience began to take effect. He allowed her to handle the horses with confidence, to assist with their injuries, and more subtly, he began to open small windows of conversation. A remark on Ashen's temperament, a timid question about her farrier's technique, even a brief observation about the afternoon's weather, all signs that the wall he had built around his heart was slowly giving way, stone by stone, to the serene persistence of the young woman who treated both the animals and himself with such care and respect. At last, Clara realized that her presence extended beyond veterinary duties. There was something she offered effortlessly, without any intention of conquest, simply presence. And it was precisely this that began to heal the shadows kept for years. Mr. Harland, a man reserved and contained, was beginning to understand that perhaps the company of the veterinarian was not confined to stables and horses, but had begun to touch something deeper, gentler, and altogether unexpected within his own heart. Night fell over the village with a softness that seemed almost magical, reflecting upon the windows lit by oil lamps and the ancient stone facades that had guarded centuries of tradition. Clara, in a gown of gentle hues that accentuated the delicacy of her features, crossed the main hall of the community pavilion with measured yet graceful steps, a natural elegance that required no effort to impress. Music played, a cheerful melody of violins and flutes that echoed through the hall, blending with restrained laughter and cordial conversations of the villagers. Clara was greeted by acquaintances and presented herself with her habitual kindness, accepting invitations to dance from gentlemen who, discreetly, admired both her beauty and her poise. Every gesture of hers was observed by attentive eyes, though not all of them were shallow. It was then, as if emerging from a shadow, that Mr. Harland made his entrance. His presence was always distinct, a mixture of reserve and natural authority that commanded respect without need of words. Seldom seen at social gatherings, he stood tall, hands clasped firmly before him, surveying the whole with quiet composure. Yet, when his eyes met Clara's,
something unexpected stirred within him, a flicker of jealousy, as subtle as it was unwelcome, coursed through his chest. Not a vulgar jealousy, but a delicate unease, the silent recognition that she drew the attention of others so effortlessly that he, perhaps, felt the weight of his own absence in her presence. Clara, in turn, could not ignore the peculiar sensation of being watched by him, a gaze that pressed and caressed at once, carrying both curiosity and a restrained approval. While dancing with a young gentleman of the village, she noticed the faint furrow of Mr. Harland's brow, and the way he leaned back, hands still crossed, breathing with a restraint that seemed almost painful. A silent flame sparked in the air between them, a promise needing no words, a mutual understanding that only glances could convey. The music ended, yet the silence that followed between them seemed more eloquent than any conversation. Clara thanked her partner with a courteous smile, but it was Mr. Harland who opened her thoughts that night. As the guests dispersed and the lights dimmed slowly, he approached with a firmness tempered by restraint. Inclining his head slightly, "You dance with a lightness that would humble even the most seasoned." Clara smiled, bowing in discreet reverence, and replied with gentle grace, "And one who dances with gentleness has no need of hurried steps." They remained for a few moments side by side, no more than a step apart, yet close enough for the tension, the fascination, and the novelty of their mutually contained feelings to become palpable. Every gesture of theirs in that instant seemed to carve a bridge over the silence and reserve of them both. As the moon climbed higher, casting its silver glow upon the now empty pavilion, Clara and Mr. Harland realized that something had changed. The presence of the other was no longer mere civility or social courtesy. It was a silent yet undeniable attraction, a delicate thread of emotion that bound two hearts once closed, now awakened, and attentive to the possibility of more than friendship. The village ball, with its music and laughter, became instead a setting for introspection and discovery. And though words were scarce between them, the intensity of their glances, the accidental brushing of hands drawn too near, and the way they observed one another in silence, ensured that the memory of that night would remain etched forever in them both. The village ball lingered as a delicate memory in Clara's mind as she returned to the farm, the night wind carrying with it the damp fragrance of earth and hay, freshly moistened by the afternoon rain. Each step upon the gravel path seemed to whisper secrets that the moon, veiled among the branches, kept silent watch over. As she drew near the stable, the warm glow of the lanterns cast long shadows across the wooden floor, spreading a gentle light that shimmered in the attentive eyes of the horses. And there she found him, Mr. Harland, his posture firm, yet uncharacteristically softened in gesture, tending to Ashen with his own hands, he who had never tolerated assistance in such ordinary tasks, moved with calm precision, cleansing the hooves, smoothing the stallion's mane with hands accustomed to the hardness of toil, yet now strikingly gentle. The sight of that stern, traditionally reserved man, absorbed in so quiet an act of care, stirred Clara's heart with a mingling of surprise and tenderness. "I see that you are quite occupied, even without need, sir," she remarked, striving for natural composure, though each word carried more weight than it seemed. He lifted his gaze, meeting hers with unexpected intensity, and replied in a voice that appeared to weigh each syllable, "It is not Ashen alone who requires attention. Your presence has brought more healing to this house than medicine ever dared to promise." The words lingered between them, soft yet heavy with restrained emotion. A warmth rushed through Clara's hands and chest. Never before had she heard so subtle, so intimate a confession from a man who had guarded himself for years behind walls of silence and sorrow. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect and understanding, knowing that this moment was more than gratitude, it was a revelation of the soul of the man before her. Ashen whinnied softly, as if acknowledging the tenderness and permission unfolding around them. Harlan's eyes, still attentive to the horse, did not fully turn from Clara. Within them was a mingling of vulnerability and recognition, a flame that required no words yet spoke directly to her own heart. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended. The scent of hay, the glow of the lantern, the distant murmur of the wind, all converged upon that instant of silent, significant nearness. Clara, with the patience she always offered the wounded creatures in her care, did not hasten. She allowed the veiled truth to settle, the silence to speak, the shared care to serve as their unspoken language. "If you will permit it, I might assist you again tomorrow," she said, her voice as gentle as the light that enveloped them. He merely inclined his head, brief but certain, and turned once more to Ashen. But something had changed. The widower's rigidity had been, almost imperceptibly, melted by a gesture of trust, by a confession that asked for no immediate reply but planted the seed of something deeper. And there, within the stable, amidst the scent of hay and the quiet warmth of human presence, Clara understood that it was not only the care of the animals that bound them, but something more, something silent yet inevitable, beginning to grow between them.
The morning dawned with the pale light of the sun filtering through the cracks in the stable, casting rays that danced upon the dust suspended in the air. Clara, carrying a bucket of feed, was distracted by the gleam of the courtyard, dampened by the morning mist. In a careless instant, her foot caught on a block of wood, and the bucket nearly slipped from her hands. Before she could react, a firm presence steadied her by the arm. The touch was brief, yet it carried more than mere assistance. It was instinctive, protective, and surprisingly intimate. Clara lifted her gaze and found Mr. Harland before her, his usually stern expression softened by a tenderness he had never allowed himself to show, yet now revealed without disguise. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice firm yet curiously hesitant. She nodded, her heart racing and her breath caught, aware that such a simple gesture seemed to alter the very order of the world around her. For a moment they remained still, as though time itself had been suspended by that touch. The scent of hay, the gentle chill of morning, the distant neighing of horses, all seemed to amplify the intimacy of that instant. For Clara, the courage to remain there, close and vulnerable, arose from a growing trust in the man before her. For Harland, the contact stirred something long buried, the realization that his heart, once locked away by grief and distance, could feel genuine affection without fear. The forgotten bucket on the ground became irrelevant. The horses, watchful, seemed to sense the change in the air, moving softly, almost reverently, before the moment that unfolded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the stillness of the stable, not only for the aid received, but for the unspoken kindness, the care that transcended words. He merely inclined his head, a minimal gesture, yet heavy with meaning, before stepping back to allow her to regain her composure. And still, that touch, brief and unassuming, had sealed an irreversible transformation. Neither dared to speak further. The silence between them now held all the promise words might fail to express. From that moment on, the stable, once a place of daily labor, became a silent witness to a nascent affection, discreet, restrained, yet undeniable, ready to bloom in the gestures yet to come.
Summer was drawing to a close, painting the orchard in shades of gold and crimson, while the light breeze carried with it the sweet fragrance of ripened fruit. Clara adjusted her satchel of instruments and papers, preparing to conclude her work on the farm. The horses grazed peacefully, Ashen lifting his head with that calm majesty which now reflected full health. The morning silence of the orchard, usually filled only with the distant song of birds, was imbued this time with something more, a subtle expectancy, almost tangible, as though the very air acknowledged the change that had taken place in the lives of those two human beings. Mr. Harland approached, his step steady, though his posture still bore the formality that had always marked him. Yet there was a softness in his shoulders, a slight curve in his stance that revealed a silent admission of feelings long restrained. He walked beside Clara, his eyes fixed upon the ground ahead, before finally lifting his face to meet hers. "Clara," he murmured, his voice low, heavy with hesitation and sincerity. "It is not only the horses to whom I owe the credit for healing. I, too, owe something to you." A shiver ran down her spine, not of fear, but of recognition. A gentle smile formed upon her lips, serene, full of understanding. No further words were required. Every gesture, every glance, every shared moment of care had already built that silent understanding. The farmer, for so long imprisoned within his own silence, seemed now to be slowly freeing himself, discovering that Clara's presence had not only healed wounds of flesh, but had also opened a space for feelings long dormant. He raised one hand, hesitant, and brushed it lightly against hers, a simple gesture, yet heavy with meaning. "I promise," he continued, his voice almost breaking, "I promise I shall not allow this heart to close again." Clara leaned slightly toward him, returning the touch, feeling the solidity and sincerity that radiated from his hand. In that instant, the orchard, the farm, the horses, all seemed to bear witness to the transformation, a man learning once more to trust, a young woman seeing her care cherished, and, above all, the promise of a future shared. They walked together toward the stable, Ashen passing between them as though recognizing and approving the silent bond now blossoming. The widower, once so rigid and withdrawn, let out a quiet laugh, a rare, genuine sound, and Clara felt her heart warm with the same sincerity that lit his smile. Summer was bidding its farewell, but a new season was being born within those two hearts. Love, respect, and companionship intertwined delicately, like the hands now entwined between them, and the farm, silent witness to so many moments, seemed to breathe with them, alive with hope, renewal, and life. When Clara at last departed, there was no bitter farewell, only an unspoken promise, a look that said everything. The days of solitude had ended, replaced by a companionship that would grow, steady, silent, yet inevitably deep. And thus Mr. Harland's heart, once imprisoned by grief, was reborn, guided by the tenderness of a young veterinarian and the quiet love that had blossomed between them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. Want to see the continuation of this story? Comment below and let us know what you think. Your opinion makes all the difference.